Dugin's demagogic conspiracy theories posing as political philosophy are key to understanding a far-right inferiority complex that extends from the Kremlin to the fever swamps of the American far-right. It's the kind of dehumanizing garbage that motivates the pillaging of Ukraine and gives Putin a kind of pretend ideological motivation. But if enough people globally continue to buy into this garbage, this neo-fascism, this illiberalism, how far and how wide could the violence spread? Joining me now are Marlene Laruelle, Director of the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University and an expert on Alexander Dugin and Russian nationalism, and Ben Teitelbaum, Associate Professor at the University of Colorado Boulder and author of War for Eternity, Inside Bannon's Far-Right Circle of Global Power Brokers. Thank you both for joining me tonight. Ben, let me start with you. It's fair, is it not, to tie what is going on in Ukraine today to the pretty fascistic ideas that Alexander Dugin has been pushing in Moscow for years now?
I think if you listen to the motivations that came from Vladimir Putin in the speech that he gave before the invasion, I do think that you hear echoes of the worldview that Alexander Dugin has been spreading in Russia for quite some time, in which you aptly summarized in your introduction. There is, in the minds of a great number of Russian elites, a sort of spiritual mandate, deep cultural claim on Ukraine that transcends the bounds of political boundaries today, and that has these deeper roots that you described. And I would add to that as well the desire to see Russia isolated in a sense from the rest of the world, which could be a consequence of these sanctions that are coming. That too belongs to a worldview that Putin has spread that looks not for globalization, not for universalism, but instead for the isolating and the creating a world of small islands where Russia still has domain over its former territories, yes, of the Soviet state. All of that you could describe as a brand of Duginism.
Marlene, I don't want to add to a chorus of voices that overstates the influence of a single philosopher, but Dugin has had an impact, especially on the Russian military, has he not? He has occasionally branded himself in interviews as a special representative of the Russian president, and many of his beliefs dovetail with official Russian talking points. And it's not just his ideas, it's him saying stuff like, kill, kill, kill Ukrainians.
Yeah, but you see one of the ambiguity that it's not because two people seems to say this more or less the same thing that there is a direct link or a direct influence. So I think here we have to be very careful in not considering that what Putin has been saying or what Russia is doing in Ukraine is a kind of direct influence on Dugin. On the contrary, I think we should to reverse the analysis is because there is a general cultural context in Russia that allow people like Dugin to kind of radicalize narrative that are present on the general intellectual scene in Russia since long time. So I think it's really a mistake to try to link what Putin is doing with the brand of Duginism. But to go back on your question on Dugin's influence in the military, indeed, at the end of the 90s, he was clearly influential among some circles of the Russian military. But it was for a relatively short period of time between the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. Since then, his books are no more mandatory. There have been a lot of other authors who have been discussing how Russia should become again a great power without having all the radicalism of Dugin. So here also you have to take into consideration the timing. What happened 15, 20 years ago is not what is happening now. It's a much more complex picture now with other intellectuals or other element of influence that have been pushing Putin's decisions that have nothing to do with Dugin.
Marlene, let me ask you this, though. Whether it's Putinism or Duginism, whatever you want to call this brand of Russian nationalism, do you believe it's a form of fascism, a particularly Russian fascism?
I think Dugin is either Russian fascist. Indeed, it's bringing a lot of the element of the European fascist culture to Russia. He has been Russifying this narrative to make it compatible with the Russian cultural framework. And he himself, as you were mentioning a few minutes ago, has been branding himself as a fascist in the 90s. He's not doing it anymore now because it's culturally difficult to do in Russia. If we want to discuss if Russia now is a fascist country or fascist regime, I think we should be much more careful. There are clearly elements, especially since the invasion of Ukraine, in Putin's speech or in speeches of other officials or media experts, that bring fascist elements very clearly, but I wouldn't put that definition on the whole Russian state as a structure.
Okay. Ben, Dugin doesn't just have influence in Russia, of course, as I pointed out in the introduction. His writing has had influence on the far right here in the US. You have Steve Bannon and people like the white nationalist Richard Spencer invoking his name, right?
Yes, absolutely. Bannon and Alexander Dugin met actually in 2018 in November in Rome. The purpose of that meeting was to try and coordinate their, what we would call propaganda efforts in their respective home countries to try and advocate for a different world order. That did not work out, as a lot of their projects don't do. But that's still certainly a branch of American conservatism that has been receptive to Dugin's message, the more radical extremes of right-wing populism.
And Marlene, you mentioned kind of, you know, what's the chicken and the egg? What came first? Is it Putin? Is it Dugin? What is driving what? But let's take a big picture look at Russia. How do you go from the Soviet Union and the fall of the Soviet Union in just a short space of time, relatively speaking, to an arch-conservative, religious-based, illiberal politics dominating a lot of Russia? Because for a lot of Americans today, the particulars of a declining world power rapidly turning away from democracy and towards autocracy feels sadly relevant.
Yeah, I think there have been an interesting trend over the last 30 years for Russia, first receiving liberalism in the 90s in a very violent manner, the collapse of the Soviet Union, very difficult years to live for everyday Russians. And then when Putin arrived in power, at the beginning, what he was rebuilding was great power, but in a kind of softer way than what it has become now. Patriotism, respect for the state, and the kind of conservative aspect and the more religious aspect arrived really later in the 2011-12 conservative turning point. And we have seen gradually this kind of religious narrative really becoming more and more influential. And here you see we are talking about Dugin, but we should be talking about the Russian Orthodox Church and the influence of Patriarch Kirill that I think are much more consequential on the way Putin has been rebuilding his own vision of the future of Russia than to talk about Dugin himself.
Ben, last question to you. Lots of people have expressed skepticism about Bannon's aspirations for an international alliance of far-right populists. I know you've been critical too. Yesterday we found out that CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, is going to Hungary next month. And the keynote speaker will be the far-right, pro-Putin, re-elected Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Orban is a darling of Tucker Carlson, of Steve Bannon, of Donald Trump. Could he become the new linchpin in a kind of far-right global axis?
Absolutely. I think that he's emerged as an icon for a type of, let's call it illiberal democracy, a type of alternative to Western liberal democracy that isn't quite totalitarian in the, let's say, the cast of Putin or something like that. So that's going to continue. I think he'll continue to be influential. I mean, you started as well your segment talking about Steve Bannon and the extent to which he's influential and which he's pushing this. It is very much his vision, whether or not he's the agent of this change or not. It is his vision to try and bring American conservatism into this ideological territory we've just been talking about. For years, people have been saying Steve Bannon is irrelevant as well, and we shouldn't be paying attention to him. That discourse has come and gone, and I expect that to continue to be the case as sectors of the American right push in this direction.
Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of the Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.